Nietzschean theology is relentless anti-humanism, which has led to it being confused with another, quasi-anti-humanistic philosophy, the deconstruction of Jacques Derrida. A philosopher who has exercised a hegemonic power over Bataille reception in recent years, the immediate roots of deconstruction lie in the phenomenology of Husserl and Heidegger, and with the later work of Heidegger in particular, it has an almost total intimacy. The dominant motif of this entire current of thought is presenting, or Anwesenheit, an event through which the phenomenon is given, associated with the operation of language. The axial insight of the later Heidegger and then Derrida, an insight that displaces Kant's critique whilst simultaneously remaining structurally analogous to it, is that presencing has been traditionally conceived on the model of presence. That is to say, the origin of the phenomenon has been conceived on the basis of the phenomenon itself, so that presencing is thought through that which it constitutes, or, as both Heidegger and Derrida come to conclude, fails to constitute. Derrida's well-known terms, writing, text, différance, etc., refer to a process of the constitution of presence that is never consummated, an interminable generative non-presence. He often describes this process in terms that echo, in an anemic fashion, Nietzsche's will to power, an insatiable creative drive, perpetually dissolving its products back into itself in an artistic frenzy without end. But such resonances do not indicate any substantive philosophical relation. The phenomenological tradition, with its fetish of awareness, is quite alien to the philosophies of the energetic unconscious that flow in a tightly compacted series from Kant through Schopenhauer and Nietzsche to Freud. There is an immense gulf between Nietzsche's aggressive genealogies that wreck unity on zero and Derrida's deconstructed phenomenology that interminably probes the border between presence and absence. Deconstructive readings are undertaken almost exclusively against the most elementary structures of signification, the binary distinction. Such readings focus upon a text whose conceptual architecture is of this dichotomous or oppositional kind, the claim being that this is, in any case, an ubiquitous characteristic of Western writing. The binary order of the concept is considered to be the ultimate basis of the myth of phenomenality, the imposition of a spurious clarity, distinctness, and coherence, whose principle is the logical law of the excluded middle. For Derrida, in superficial agreement with Hegel's phenomenology of reason, identity and negation are both modes of presence. Derrida's twist is to suggest that the excluded middle, or the difference between identity and non-identity, is never successfully excluded, but is rather subject to a failed repression. The reason for this, to outline it very sketchily, rests on a principle shared by thinkers as various as Spinoza, Hegel, and Saussure, that presence is a contrastive concept. To be present is to have been rigorously differentiated from non-presence, which means that differentiation itself, since it is the condition of presence, is unpresentable. Since difference or non-presence cannot be lucidly represented, it is impossible for anything to be rigorously distinguished from it, which means that the conditions of presence are unrealizable. The task of deconstructive reading is the recovery of the written difference, which Derrida calls the trace, and which interferes with the constitution of identity and difference as lucid concepts. The procedure of deconstruction is to first reverse the traditional value hierarchy encrusted in the opposition of terms, and then to explicitly mark a third term, one that has been deployed within the text inconsistently. This third term derives its value from both sides of the opposition, operating as a partially concealed pseudo-concept with incoherent predicates. This term will be a name for presencing or writing, and its discovery consummates a given deconstruction. Although Derrida's work can be rather baffling at first, especially since his prose style has inherited a considerable dosage of Teutonic inelegance and obscurity, the implications of his machinery of reading for Nietzsche's theological program are quite straightforward. He considers atheism to be, at best, a tactical step on the way to the deconstruction of theology, and in effect, even this is a step he seems uninterested in. But even if Derrida were subject to an anti-theistic inclination, he could only be driven by his philosophy to search for that which institutes the difference between the presence and absence of God, something like Schelling's Absolute or Heidegger's Being, a search which is scarcely distinguishable from moves long familiar to radical theologians. Heidegger himself saw no contradiction between such a position and a continuing adherence to what is perhaps the most ideologically compromised variant of Christian belief, Southern German Roman Catholicism. Before examining Nietzsche's irreducibility to deconstruction a little more carefully, it is worth briefly introducing the arguments of Jean-François Lyotard, who even in his early Nietzschean stage is caught up in a quasi-deconstructionist position on the question of atheism. There is no doubt that during the period ending 1974, with Économie libidinale, Lyotard is far closer to Nietzsche's thought than Derrida has ever been, a symptom of which is Lyotard's attachment to psychoanalytical rather than phenomenological modes of inquiry. Nevertheless, even at this stage of his work, Lyotard disavows the space of atheism with a finality easily comparable with Derrida's. He considers atheism to be reactive, repeating a gesture of negation that belongs to theology rather than to the impulsions of an energetic unconscious, which, as Freud argues, knows no negativity. What Nietzschean thought requires, he suggests, is a disinvestment of monotheism and not a critique of it. Christianity should not be attacked but abandoned, since atheism merely perpetuates the memory traces that foster the depressive states of ressentiment and disgust. Lyotard seeks to persuade his readers that the thought of the death of God merely dampens libidinal intensities if it is treated as anything other than a matter of indifference. God should bore us into forgetting rather than provoking us into revolt. What Derrida and Lyotard share, and where they both diverge from Nietzsche, is the supposition that atheism is an instance of negation, rather than a transmutation or transvaluation of its sense. For Nietzsche, it is facile to accuse atheism of having a recourse to a notion of negativity, which is itself essentially theological, because to do so is to remain passively within a socio-historically realized theological space that continues to organize the meanings of all terms. Negation is reforged in the celebration of the death of God to mean the way in which God is not, and this is a sense which is incommensurate with the negation that was permitted within theology and the metaphysics conditioned by it. To say there is no God is not to express a proposition in a pre-established logical syntax, but to begin thinking again in a way that is radically new and therefore utterly experimental. Zero is fatally discovered beneath the scabrous crust of logical negativity. It is obscurantism of the most tediously familiar kind to suggest that the nothing of nihilism is an indissolubly theological concept. The nihil is not a concept at all, but rather immensity and fate. Nietzsche describes atheism as an open horizon, as a loss of inhibition. The A of atheism is privative only in the sense of a collapsing dam. Deconstruction is the systematic closure of the negative within its logico-structural sense. All uses, references, connotations of the negative are referred back to a bilateral opposition as if to an inescapable destination, so that every d, un, dis, or and is speculatively imprisoned within the mirror space of the concept. If we were to follow deconstruction to the letter here, it would follow that atheism, anti-humanism, and anti-logic, far from being virulent pestilential swamps, had no force except through their determinate relations to their enemies, which had thus always already bilateralized them into docility. As for deconstruction itself, it likes to suffer. Such logicization of the negative leads to Derrida thinking loss as irreducible suspension, delay, or difference, in which decision is paralyzed between the postponement of an identity and its replacement. Suspension does not resolve itself into annihilation, but only into a trace or remnant that has always been distanced from plenitude rather than deriving from it, so that difference is only loss in the non-sense of irreparable expenditure, insofar as this can be described as the insistence of an unapproachable possibility, which is to say, under the aegis of a fundamental domestication. In Freud and the Scene of Writing, Derrida is overt in his commensuration of difference with the reality principle, reading both as instances of the regulation of discharges. Differance channels the descent of affective quanta, rerouting them into a detour, which has always already begun, in order that their efflux can be adapted to the exigency of repetition. In a peculiar series of moves, Derrida brands desire with a metaphysical inclination, shifting it from an energetic to a phenomenological register, which then allows him to transcendentalize repression by aligning it with the impossibility of pure presence, and to implicitly juggle the thought of repression so that it becomes the repression of the acknowledgement of the necessity of repression of writing as repression of impossible inclination. Thus, he redoubles the epistemo-contemplative terms of diagnosis, valorizes the martyrdom of the ego, changes the signs of psychoanalysis whilst reinforcing its secondary process politics, attempts the elimination of all possible reference to a material, sacrificial, and generative unconscious that is beyond phenomenological recuperation, and, in general, produces one of the most coherent apologetics of libidinal vivisection ever written, all garbed in a spuriously subversive rhetoric. In terms of the social dissemination of his discourse, Derrida is perhaps our Hegel, an assimilator in the service of the great tradition of authoritarian reason and toothless academic professionalism, facilitated by the sophistication of problems into the philosophical stratosphere. Like Hegel, he is obsessed by the reference of all things to the concept, by oppositional relations, both profess to resist, redirect, struggle against them. Representation, dependency, the saturating prevalence of logos, and capture. Their thinking also shares the unattractive characteristic of thriving upon the frustration of rupture and the sentimental pathos of overwhelming inheritance. Both conceive and practice revolt as a strategy of intelligent conversation. Both write in a ghoulish technical jargon squirming within a tortured syntax. Indeed, the most basic lesson Derrida learns from Heidegger, almost certainly unconsciously, is how to save the socio-political prestige which Hegel attains for philosophy, the reserve of secondary process apologetic, from the ludicrously over-emphatic idealism of speculative thought. The strategy adopted in both cases is essentially Kantian. If there is something you want to protect, attack it with measured vigor yourself, thus investing it with replenished force and preempting its annihilation. If it is Heidegger who is the most successful practitioner of such conquest as the transfer of defensive responsibility, Derrida still remains his most eager disciple. Thus it is that the text of Western metaphysics finds itself subject to a general destruction, deconstruction, or restorative critique, which, amongst other things, fabricates it into a totality, rescues it from its own decrepit self-legitimations, generalizes its effects across other texts, reinforces its institutional reproduction, solidifies its monopolistic relation to truth, confirms all but the most preposterous narratives of its teleological dignity, nourishes its hierophantic power of intimidation, smothers its real enemies beneath a blizzard of pseudo-irritations, its unsaid or margins, keeps its political prisoners locked up, repeats its lobotomizing stylistic traits and sociological complacency, and, in the end, begins to mutter once more about an unnameable God. Deconstruction is like capital, managed and reluctant to change. An important instance of pseudo-contact is found in Derrida's discussion of Nietzsche and femininity in Spurs, a text that serves as a supplement to Heidegger's interpretation of the will to power as art. This reading marks out some traits of Nietzsche's sexuality, a sexuality of and as writing, indicating a web of relations to the history and structure of logocentric metaphysics. The condensation of these remarks into a pointed proposition, a stylate form that is more frequent in Derrida's texts than many of his commentators imply, might generate something like this. Nietzsche's textuality is worked by a repressed lesbian stratum that subverts the traditional logic of truth and appearance. According to Derrida, the system of repression that partially dominates Nietzsche's writing is orchestrated by a principle of castration, having two moments, articulated as follows. 1. He dreaded this castrated woman. 2. He dreaded this castrating woman. Castration is determined in thought as a plenitude threatened by absence, of a plus and minus distributed by the law of the excluded middle. It is thus the fundamental psychological repercussion of metaphysics. Freud suggests in many places that it is this structure itself in its purest state, that has governed the construction of gender within Western history. Because castration is a matter of the distribution of a moment of pure and ultimate lack, it is readily associated with the problematic of disappropriation. Derrida reads this difference between having and not having as itself regulated by a more primordial appropriative moment that cannot be characterized either by plenitude or lack. He takes this appropriative difference to be a moment of deconstructive lesbian excess that he expresses in the phrase, he loved this affirming woman. In Nietzsche's text, as the unstable principle of its unfurling, can be found the figure of woman in love with herself. The logic of these movements closely parallels that of Heidegger's The Will to Power as Art lectures, for which the collapse of the truth-appearance opposition at the end of Nietzsche's How the True World at Last Became a Fable is celebrated as the breakdown of a repressive and unreformable dyadic scheme, a herausdrehen, a twisting out or writhing free of metaphysics. Derrida somewhat surreptitiously inserts a figure of lesbian desire into this problematic against the grain of the ponderous masculinity of Heideggerian prose in order to mark the auto-affection of non-identity or the asymmetric other of the phallus in touch with her non-self. The compromises that box in this intervention are legion, since once again it is a difference between presence and absence that finally orchestrates it. That it retains a certain seductiveness stems from the fact that it partially captures a shift from bilateral reflection to unilateral propulsion that is profoundly consonant with Nietzsche's thinking, even though the shift is crushed into the border zone at the edge of a phenomenological determination of plenitude. Zero, or the sacred, is retained within the constriction of profane negativity, and religious fate is interpreted through the technical prowess of philosophy. At the end of a note from the late spring of 1888, numbered 811 in the compilation entitled The Will to Power, Nietzsche argues that a woman's aesthetics, biased towards the question of receptivity, have dominated our understanding of art. He suggests that one should not demand of the artist, who gives, that he becomes a woman and receives. The production of art is characterized as masculine, whilst the reception of art, including the entire history of aesthetics, and even philosophy as a whole, is allotted to the feminine. Even though this unstable construction is a blatant efflorescence out of repression, since it collapses profligacy onto the polar terms of an exchange relation constituting reciprocal or bilateral gender identities, it allows us to pursue Nietzsche's thinking about art into the inhuman squandering that guides and ruins it. Nietzsche provides us with some further markers into this abyss earlier in the same note, where he describes the artistic condition as follows. The extreme sharpness of certain senses, so they understand a quite different sign language and create one, the condition that seems to be a part of many nervous disorders. Extreme mobility that turns into an extreme urge to communicate, the desire to speak on the part of everything that knows how to give signs, a need to get rid of oneself, as it were, through signs and gestures, ability to speak of oneself through 100 speech media, an explosive condition. One must first think of this condition as a compulsion and urge to get rid of the exuberance of inattention through muscular activity and movements of all kinds. Then, as an involuntary coordination between this movement and the inner processes, images, thoughts, desires, as a kind of automatism of the whole muscular system, impelled by strong stimuli from within, inability to prevent reaction, the system of inhibition suspended, as it were. And later, the compulsion to imitate, an extreme irritability through which a given model becomes contagious. A state is guessed on the basis of signs and immediately depicted. An image rising up within immediately turns into a movement of the limbs, a certain suspension of the will. Schopenhauer, a kind of deafness and blindness towards the external world, the realm of admitted stimuli, is rigorously delimited. The artistic process is thus likened to a contagion and a nervous illness, an explosion of abreactive gestures with their associated intensities. The inhibition to this outflow collapses, but the admission of new material is sharply reduced. In other words, the powers of absorption are suppressed. Anorexia is coupled with logorrhea, or extreme volubility, and art is thought on the basis of a violent wasting disease. There is a peculiar economic model at work here, in which a disequilibrium between expenditure and income is pushed towards its extreme. From a bourgeois perspective, what we are faced with is the ultimate form of dangerous madness, a process of anti-accumulation that is totally out of control. There are obvious difficulties in grasping the possibility of this economy due to the industrial tendency which denies that it could be basic. Chronic squandering violates the reciprocity which governs the logics of both Aristotle and Hegel, since it is incompatible with the principle that determination equals negation, according to which every loss is correlated with an associated gain. Both Aristotelians and Hegelians can become competent accountants, accepting the logical basis of double-entry bookkeeping, which is why bourgeois and Marxist economists are so often able to understand each other very easily. Nietzsche's remarks, on the contrary, tend to depart from intelligible human economy from the first. The demand in The Will to Power as Art that one ought not to demand of the artist who gives that he should become a woman evokes an episode from the history of how the true world at last became a fable. Progress of the idea. It becomes more delicate, seductive, unattainable. It becomes a woman. It becomes Christian. If this conjunction is read as saying, it becomes a woman and therefore becomes Christian, we can append much of Nietzsche's often ferociously anti-feminine rhetoric to this phrase. For instance, in another note gathered under the heading of The Will to Power as Art from about this time, he writes, "What pleases all pious women, old or young? A saint with beautiful legs, still young, still an idiot." The problem with such a reading is that Christianity is an identitarian monotheism insulated against zero and a privileged graveyard of the sacred, burying the vortex of vulva-cosmic disillusion beneath the monument of eternal being. Nietzsche is not trapped at the edge of a deconstruction, oscillating between presence and absence, but is rather scrabbling at the secondary process security of partial unity, fending off zero with the detritus of logical negation. If, as Derrida indicates, the pious woman is Nietzsche's synonym for the castrato, we can see that this figure is the opposite of the artist within a heavily revised delirium of wastage. A castrate capital that can only gorge itself and accumulate opposes the delirious anorexic maniac who throws away everything he has. But here we are back to the reciprocal determination and double-entry bookkeeping, the condition of impossibility for art, in other words, absolute capitalism. Castration distills a pure piety of engorgement that drives the artist into a proletarian destitution. Nietzsche is not unaware of this predicament, and in the passage that immediately precedes How the True World at Last Became a Fable in Twilight of the Idols, he writes, "To separate the world into the true and the apparent, be it in the Christian fashion or in that of Kant, a cunning Christian to the end, is only a suggestion of decadence, a symptom of declining life. That the artist treasures appearance above reality is no objection to this proposition, because here appearance means reality once again, only selected, strengthened, corrected." The story traced by How the True World at Last Became a Fable is that of our history, but it is a superficial process when compared to the prehistory that provides the resources and genealogical sense. The prehistorical narrative leads up to the events which the historical narrative presupposes, the suppression of the Dionysian impulse and its spontaneous flow of unredeemed expenditure into a rationality of conservation and opposition. This dawning of history is traced more fully in the note numbered 584 in The Will to Power, a text of sustained power, including this one small fragment. "And behold, suddenly the world fell apart into a true world and an apparent world, and precisely the world that man's reason had devised for him to live and settle in was discredited. Instead of employing the forms as a tool for making the world manageable and calculable, the deranged acuity of philosophers divine that in these categories is presented the concept of the world to which the one in which man lives does not correspond. The means were misunderstood as measures of value, even as a condemnation of their real intention. The intention was to deceive oneself in a useful way. The means, the invention of formulas and signs by means of which one could reduce the confusing multiplicity to a purposive and manageable schema. Where a cumulative reason has instituted truth and appearance as unsurpassable finalities or pure concepts, the artist understands appearance as reality once again, noch einmal. Reality returns in appearance like the ripple of a shockwave, opening wider and wider domains for migration. Since reality is itself the stimulus for such migrations, they will become progressively more devastating, as this stimulus becomes progressively selected, strengthened, corrected, or, to abbreviate, intensified. Here at last, where nothing is last, is the convulsion of zero, eternal recurrence, the libidinal motor of Nietzsche's economics. Nietzsche's economy of the artistic process, or Dionysian economy, is built beneath the Vesuvian anti-logic of eternal recurrence. Such an economy is a perpetual re-emergence of inhuman squandering, an inappropriable excess messily exhibited in the transfiguration of negation into profligate zero. It is intrinsic to desire that it always has fresh and, when unmutilated by repression, increasingly sophisticated constructions to waste. A Dionysian economy is, indeed, a slash-and-burn agriculture of soulless stock, in which the negative limit of each conceptual dyad is reconstituted as an intensification of the positive, as an increasing virulence of difference. The delirium of squandering flows from this inevitability that logical negation never arrives, even though zero impacts. In other words, the thought of eternal recurrence is this, that the abolition of integrated being in the process of desire, or unconstrained wastage, corresponds to an intensification of plague, and not a, logically intelligible, negation of assets. Epidemic difference is only enhanced by the spasmodic aberration from itself. A Dionysian economy is the flux of impersonal desire perpetually re-energized in the pulse of recurrence, in the upsurge of new realities. These resurgent waves of intensity are situated at the point which patriarchal productivism has reserved for its limit, at the end of each becoming a woman, which are misconstrued as specific negations. Desire could thus be said to be nothing but becoming a woman at different levels of intensity, although of course it is always possible to become a pious woman, to begin a history, love masculinity, and accumulate. Because to become a woman is to depart from reality, and no one loves fables more than the church. But reality drifts upon zero, and can be abandoned over and over again. In the lesbian depths of the unconscious, desires for, as, feminizing spasms of remigration are without limit. Everything populating the desolate wastes of the unconscious is lesbian. Difference sprawled upon zero, multiplicity strewn across positive vulvic space. Masculinity is nothing but a shoddy bunkhole from death. Socio-historically, phallus and castration might be serious enough, but cosmologically they merely distract from zero, staking out a meticulously constructed poverty and organizing its logical displacement. If deconstruction spent less time playing with its willy, maybe it could cross the line.